Daniel Harper had handled hundreds of cases, but the moment his client placed the photo on the table, the air in the office changed. And Daniel felt it before he understood it, a sharp unease pressing against his chest as he glanced down out of habit rather than curiosity, expecting the usual grainy image of a stranger. Yet what stared back at him stopped his breath completely because the woman in the picture was his wife. Emily, caught in a moment that felt too real to ignore, standing outside a small cafe with warm lights glowing behind her. Her coat open, her posture relaxed, her face softened by a smile Daniel had not seen in months. And across from her sat a man leaning forward as if every word she spoke mattered. And in that instant, Daniel's mind raced faster than his heart, trying to make sense of how his professional life had collided with his personal world without warning. As the client, Mark Collins, spoke in a low, tense voice about suspicions and late nights, while Daniel struggled to keep his expression neutral. His training forcing him to breathe evenly while memories rushed in uninvited. Images of Emily leaving early with a distracted kiss, of quiet dinners where her eyes drifted elsewhere, of conversations that ended too soon. And he realized with a cold clarity that the signs had been there. Only he had chosen not to see them because his job had taught him to chase truths everywhere, except at home. And now the truth had found him anyway, sitting between legal folders and a cup of untouched coffee, daring him to look closer. Daniel slid the photo back toward himself slowly, noting the date stamp in the corner. Recent enough to hurt, recent enough to matter. And Mark's voice continued, explaining how he had hired Daniel to confirm a feeling he could not shake. Never. Knowing he had chosen the worst possible man for the job, and Daniel nodded, asking steady questions out of habit, where the photo was taken, how often these meetings happened, whether there were more images, and each answer felt like another step forward on ground that was already cracking beneath him, 'cause Emily had promised him honesty when they married, promised that no matter how busy life became, they would never become strangers. Yet here she was, familiar and distant all at once, captured in a frame that said more than words ever could. And as Daniel listened, he felt anger try to rise, but it tangled with guilt just as quickly, 'cause he knew how often he had chosen work over home, how many times he had told himself he would make it up to her later, how many evenings he had come home tired and silent, assuming love could survive on memory alone. And now that assumption stood exposed under fluorescent lights, unprotected and fragile. Mark finally stopped talking, waiting for reassurance, for direction. And Daniel realized he had to make a decision in that moment, not as a husband, but as a professional. 'Cause backing out would raise questions, and continuing would lead him deeper into a truth he was not ready to face. Yet something inside him, sharpened by years of uncovering lies, refused to turn away. And he agreed to continue the investigation with a calm tone that surprised even himself, outlining next steps, possible outcomes, all while his mind replayed the image again and again. Emily's smile burning itself into him as if asking why he was not the one sitting across from her. And when the meeting ended and Mark left, Daniel remained alone in the office. The city humming outside the window, the photo still on the table, no longer evidence, but a mirror reflecting everything he had avoided. And he realized this was no longer about proving betrayal or innocence, but about confronting the space that had grown between two people who once believed love was enough. And as he finally picked up the photo again, studying the details he had missed at first, the way Emily's shoulders were relaxed, the way she leaned slightly forward, the way the moment looked unguarded, Daniel understood that whatever came next would not be simple, would not be clean, and would not leave him unchanged. Because the case had already done its damage, not by what it revealed, but by forcing him to see that the greatest mysteries are often hidden in plain sight. Waiting for the moment when denial finally runs out, Daniel did not say a word to Emily. That night, not because he was calm, but because his mind moved too fast for anger. And as he drove home, the city lights blurred past him while the photo stayed sharp in his thoughts, replaying every small detail until he felt like a stranger entering his own life. And when he stepped into the house, Emily greeted him with the same soft smile she always used, asking about his day while setting her keys down, and Daniel answered with short words, watching her closely without meaning to, noticing how she moved with quiet care, how she paused before checking her phone, how she tucked it away as soon as he looked at her. And none of it was loud or careless, which somehow made it harder, because everything felt gentle, careful, almost respectful, as if she were guarding something fragile. And that thought followed him through dinner, where conversation stayed light and safe, through the sound of dishes in the sink, through the evening news playing low in the background while they sat on opposite ends of the couch, sharing space but not thoughts, and Daniel realized how used they had become to silence. Comfort had slowly replaced closeness without either of them noticing, and later in bed he lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing, remembering nights when they used to talk until sleep caught them mid-sentence, when her hand would find his without thinking, when plans for the future felt exciting instead of distant. And now those memories pressed against him like questions with no easy answers. The next day, Daniel returned to work and forced himself into motion, diving into the case because stillness felt dangerous. And he reviewed timelines, locations, and notes with sharp focus, learning that Emily met the man from the photo during a local charity event months earlier, that their meetings followed a simple pattern: public places, short times, no secrecy beyond silence. And as Daniel followed this trail, he felt something unexpected. Not rage, but a deep, quiet sadness. Because the evidence did not point to recklessness, but to loneliness. And that realization cut deeper than any lie. And each step he took as an investigator felt like a step backward as a husband, forcing him to admit how absent he had been, how often he had chosen long hours and closed doors over conversation, telling himself it was all for them while slowly leaving her alone inside a marriage that still looked whole from the outside. Daniel watched Emily from a distance when he could, not spying but observing the space between moments, seeing how she walked slower now, how she seemed thoughtful even in crowds, how her smile faded quickly when she thought no one was watching. And it became clear that whatever she felt was not excitement but confusion, a quiet pull toward someone who listened without distraction. And that truth unsettled Daniel more than any dramatic betrayal could have, because it left no villain to blame, only to people who had drifted apart without meaning to. And at night he struggled to decide what to do, turning over the same questions again and again, whether to confront her immediately or wait, whether honesty now would heal or shatter what remained. And he understood that once he spoke, there would be no return to comfort, no pretending that love alone could fix what time and neglect had worn thin. Days passed quickly and slowly all at once, and Daniel felt himself standing at the edge of something fragile, aware that silence was becoming a choice rather than a pause. And when he finally looked at Emily across the breakfast table one morning, saw the tired kindness in her eyes, the care she still showed in small ways, he knew that whatever truth existed between them deserved space and patience, not anger thrown too soon. And he made a quiet promise to himself to see the full picture before speaking, to understand not just what she had done, but why. 'Cause love, he realized, was not only about loyalty, but about presence. And without presence, even the strongest promises could fade. And as Daniel prepared to take the next step in the investigation, he understood that the case was no longer about catching someone doing wrong, but about uncovering what had been missing for far too long. And that knowledge weighed on him heavily as he moved forward, knowing the truth, once fully seen, would demand more than answers. It would demand change. Daniel had traced the man in the photo, learning quickly that his name was Ryan Brooks, a quiet man who taught high school and lived alone after losing his wife years ago. And as Daniel pieced together the details, he realized the encounters Emily had with Ryan were nothing like the scenarios his mind had conjured. No secret hotels, no hidden rendezvous, only coffee shops, long conversations, and walks along the river where the city felt distant and private. And knowing this made Daniel's chest tighten in ways he hadn't expected. Because it was not betrayal in the dramatic sense, but a subtle emotional distance that had grown. Between him and Emily, a slow drift filled with silences, missed opportunities, and moments he had taken for granted. And yet, even knowing the harmless nature of these meetings did not ease the pain. It only sharpened his awareness of what had been missing at home: the attention, the listening, the quiet presence that Ryan offered without effort. Something Daniel realized he had stopped giving, consumed by work and the routines of life. And when he returned home that evening, he saw Emily moving around the kitchen with the same gentle motions he remembered, but now tinged with something softer, more vulnerable, as if she carried a small weight that had nothing to do with him directly, yet everything to do with what they had allowed to slip away. And Daniel knew that confronting her would change the quiet balance of their lives. So he waited until the rain fell steadily outside, the sound against the windows giving him courage to speak the truth he had held back, placing the photo on the table between them and watching her face, noting how her eyes widened, how her lips parted slightly as if caught off guard. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost broken, admitting everything she had felt. Oh, the loneliness that had grown in small increments, the relief of someone listening without judgment, the confusing emotions that made her heart ache for attention she hadn't realized she craved so deeply. And Daniel listened, feeling each word like a thread pulling at the fabric of their marriage, unraveling assumptions and revealing gaps he had never wanted to see. And he realized that this conversation, though painful, was necessary because love left unattended could not sustain itself. And the silence they had kept for months had only amplified the longing for connection elsewhere, even if that elsewhere had never crossed a line of physical intimacy. Emily's confession continued, the honesty pouring out of her like a river that had been dammed for too long, telling him about the quiet comfort Ryan offered. How he asked questions she wanted to answer, how he remembered details about her life. And Daniel understood fully that it was not a story of infidelity in action, but a story of absence and need. A reflection of what they both had failed to nurture in their marriage. And the weight of this truth pressed against him, forcing him to confront his own failures, the missed dinners, the late nights, the half-hearted reassurances he had given to keep peace without truly engaging. And he felt a mix of sorrow and clarity, a painful acknowledgement that love required active care, not assumption. And as Emily looked at him with a mix of guilt and hope, Daniel knew he had a choice to make, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Whether to let this fracture define the rest of their life together or to begin rebuilding from the place of honesty they had finally reached. And he realized that confronting Ryan's presence was only a part of the process. The larger part was facing the emptiness that had allowed this emotional connection to form outside their marriage. And he understood that it would take time, patience, and deliberate effort to bridge the gap that had grown over years. Yet even in this moment of uncertainty, Daniel felt a spark of determination, a willingness to listen, to forgive, and to find a way back to the intimacy they had neglected. And when Emily finished speaking, tears in her eyes but a faint smile on her lips, Daniel reached across the table, placing his hand over hers, a simple gesture of presence and commitment, acknowledging that the journey ahead would not be easy. That trust would need to be rebuilt carefully, that conversations would have to be honest even when uncomfortable, and that the marriage they both wanted was still possible if they faced the truth together. And in that shared silence, Daniel felt both the weight of the mistakes and the fragile hope of what could come next, realizing that love, once lost in routine and neglect, could still be recovered if two people chose to meet each other fully, without pretense or denial, willing to confront the past to shape a better future. And as the rain tapped against the window, Daniel and Emily sat side by side, no words spoken for a moment, letting the honesty between them settle. Knowing that the hardest step had been taken, the truth laid bare, and now the work of healing could begin. Emily ended things with Ryan the very next day. Not because Daniel demanded it, but because the truth she had shared with him made her realize what truly mattered. And from that moment, both she and Daniel faced a quiet, delicate tension in their home that neither could ignore. A space filled with unspoken words and cautious glances, yet also the first real hope they had felt in months. And Daniel threw himself into their conversations with a careful focus, listening as she recounted thoughts and feelings she had buried, exploring the cracks in their marriage that had allowed emotional distance to grow. And Emily, in turn, began noticing the ways he was present again. How he paused to ask her about her day, how he remembered the little details she loved. Oh! How he no longer answered quickly just to move past discussion, but truly engaged. And though some nights were heavy with tears and regret, other nights carried laughter, soft but genuine, moments that reminded them both of why they had fallen in love years ago, of how shared memories could still spark warmth, even when the past felt fragile. And Daniel realized that forgiveness was not a single act, but a continuous choice, an active effort to see her clearly, to understand without judgment, to rebuild trust from the ground up. And Emily recognized that love required courage, honesty, and willingness to stay even when the path was uncertain, not running to easy comfort elsewhere. And together, they began counseling, attending sessions where each word and silence mattered, learning to communicate without fear, learning to be present with one another rather than assuming connection would survive without attention. And as days passed, Daniel reflected on the irony that the photo which had initially brought shock and pain had ultimately forced them to confront the very gaps they had avoided for too long. Gaps filled not with infidelity, but with neglect, miscommunication, and the quiet drift of routine. And in acknowledging these gaps, they found a chance to grow closer than before, to see each other's needs and fears without defensiveness, to rebuild intimacy on honesty rather than assumption. And as they walked together through their neighborhood one afternoon, past familiar streets and local cafes, Daniel noticed Emily's hand brush against his, a fleeting touch that carried years of love, mistakes, and renewed trust. And when she looked up at him with a small smile, he felt the weight of the past lighten slightly, knowing that while the journey ahead would be neither simple nor fast, it was theirs to take together. And months later, they returned to the street where the photo had been taken, the cafe lights glowing warmly. And Daniel felt a quiet thrill mixed with relief that they had survived the emotional storm, that they had faced uncomfortable truths and chosen each other despite the uncertainty. And when Emily reached for his hand, asking softly if he thought they would be okay, Daniel looked at her, the woman he still loved, flawed and human, strong and vulnerable, and he answered honestly, admitting that he did not know what the future held, but that he was choosing her again, willing to work, to listen, to care, to love in ways he had forgotten. And as they walked down the street together, hand in hand, the past no longer chasing them, but lingering as a reminder of lessons learned. Daniel felt that hope and commitment could coexist with fear and doubt, that love required constant effort, and that even after mistakes, hearts could reconnect when both people were willing to be seen, to be honest, and to embrace the journey of rebuilding. And in that moment, with the city lights flickering around them, laughter drifting from nearby cafes, and the soft evening air brushing past, Daniel and Emily took a step forward together, carrying the past in memory, but not in resentment, moving into a future shaped by choice, presence, and a love that had been tested but not broken. And as they continued walking, their hands intertwined, they knew the story of their marriage was not finished, but the hardest chapter had passed, leaving room for healing, connection, and the quiet promise of renewed closeness.